Good evening again, everybody. Tonight's topic, loving the stranger, the Bible's moral. I want to try and do two things. We're going to focus on the first, but we'll also get to the second, I hope. I want to explore, and I'll explain what I mean by this in just a minute, or actually in a little while, one of the Bible's greatest moral challenges and what turns out to be one of the Bible's greatest moral revolutions. And then second, I want to at least briefly think a bit about empathy and its critics. Many writers for a long time have been arguing that empathy has the power to save the world. There's, books with titles like The Empathic Civilization and things like that. And more recently, some very outspoken writers, that is, have argued that empathy could actually destroy civilization, which is a very counterintuitive claim. And I want to at least get us thinking about that because, as we'll see, the Bible's notion of loving the stranger is deeply bound up with notions of empathy. Okay. Now, one thing that many of you have heard me say many times before, in order to really hear biblical texts, we have to defamiliarize ourselves with them. We have to try to suspend what we think we know about them so that we can hear them again for the first time. Some of the verses that we're going to look at tonight, I'm guessing, are familiar to many people, but I'm going to ask you as much as you can to sort of suspend what you think you know about them so that you can hear them again for the first time. As I never tire of quoting Jonathan Lear, philosopher at the University of Chicago, has this notion that the greatest obstacle to learning is knowing. If you know something, you can't actually learn it anymore. And I think that's often true for people in their relationship to sort of well-worn verses from Tanakh. Before we get going, I want to say one other thing, and I'll elaborate on this as I go later on. Translating the word ger, which is going to be the central word of our class tonight, is actually quite complex. The JPS translation, which we'll be using, translates ger as stranger. I will tell you that no matter how many times I explain otherwise, when I've traveled around the country talking about these texts, people find it very hard to overcome the idea that stranger means someone I don't know. And that's not what stranger means at all. I mean, it's related to that. But as we'll see, a stranger is someone who is an outsider, not part of the kin group, and thereby not part of the in group, and thereby vulnerable to exploitation, either politically, economically, or whatever. Older translations tended to render the ger as a sojourner. That feels like archaic English, but in some ways, I think it captures the meaning better. More recently, and I'll talk more about this later, more recently, some Bible scholars have argued that a better rendering of ger would simply be immigrant. And we'll get to that. And that predates the Trump era. It's not particularly politically loaded. We'll get to there as we go. Okay. So let's turn now, Ileana, if you can load up the sources. Let's turn now to the first source. What I want to try to do is begin by walking through the Bible's progression of our relationship to the ger. Shemot, Exodus 23 says the following. V'ger lo tilchatz, you shall not oppress a stranger. V'atem yedatem et nefesh hager, because you know the life of the stranger. I think JPS here gets the thrust of the text, if not the literal meaning. You know the feelings of the stranger. Ki gerim hiyitem be'eretz Mitzrayim, because you yourselves were strangers in the land of Egypt. Now, we should clarify something that I think is easily mistaken. I do not think that the Bible thinks that the prohibition on oppressing the stranger derives from the fact that the Israelites were strangers in the land of Egypt. Because what is a moral prohibition is a moral prohibition. If it derived from Israel's experience of enslavement and being strangers, then Pharaoh could come along and say, well, that obligation does not fall on me, because I don't have that experience. So as Rabbi Eliyahu Mizrahi, one of the great commentators on Rashi's commentary, points out, this is more of an intensification, right? There's a moral obligation that is always there. You don't take advantage of the vulnerable. But Israel specifically is being told, because you had the experience of being vulnerable and actually went through the exploitation that goes along with that, you especially should know and should be especially careful to live up to this basic moral norm. Okay? Now, nefesh, I think it's worth saying, nefesh in rabbinic Hebrew means soul. In biblical Hebrew means life. Originally means throat and then comes to mean life. If you want to know why the word for throat comes to mean life, imagine, God forbid, that someone comes up to you and punches you in the throat and the life goes out of you. So in the ancient world, many people thought that the seat of life was in the throat. But you know the nefesh, you know the total experience of the stranger. And as I said, I think JPS gets the idea of this right. You know what it feels like. This is very clearly an appeal to empathy. You have some sense of what it was like to be in the situation that they now find themselves in. Okay, now we're going to scroll down to Leviticus and we'll see what Leviticus does. As I'm going to sort of point out, as the Torah progresses, the Israelites' obligation to strangers becomes more and more intense and more radicalized. So Leviticus 19 says, it starts out by essentially recapitulating Exodus 23. When a stranger lives with you in your land, you shall not mistreat him. Rather, ka'ezrach mikem yelachem hagar itchem. Now, JPS renders the stranger who resides with you shall be to you as one of your citizens. I'm not so persuaded that the word ezrach means citizen in biblical Hebrew. It means that in modern Hebrew. I think I would translate this as like one of your native born. I think ezrach is a description of where you come from, not of a political status. So the stranger who lives with you shall be as one of your native born. That is someone who you feel the obligations of kinship with. And then the ultimate radicalization, ve'ahavta lo kamocha, and you should love him as yourself, kigerim hiyitem be'eretz Mitzrayim, because you were strangers in the land of Egypt.
The expression "make yourself at home."
Ani Adonai Elohechem. If people could mute themselves, that would be great. Okay. Now, here's the thing. So Leviticus 19, as we saw last week, says, love your neighbor as yourself. Here, essentially what we're being told is whatever love of the neighbor means, and we saw this tremendous debate about that point, that same love is to be extended to the stranger who is not part of the covenant community. Remember, Rhea, I said, is a fellow member of the covenant. I think that's what it means. I think it's clearly what it means. That's a lecture for another time. But here, it's not just the people who are part of your kin group, but also the people who are outsiders living amidst your kin group. They too are to be the recipients of your love. Now, what has happened here is that a mitzvat lo ta'aseh, a negative commandment, a prohibition in simpler language in Exodus, has now become a mitzvat aseh, a positive obligation of love. Not just don't oppress the stranger, and love the stranger. And again, you were strangers in the land of Egypt. You especially should know how badly. Jared, you're not muted. Okay, so okay, now here's a couple of things I want to make. What I think is in many ways the central observation about this that that if I can offer anything about this, it's probably this. This idea, even if we don't live up to it all the time, this idea is so well known that it's hard to hear how radical it is, because there is nothing, in fact, obvious about this. You could imagine a moral, or at least an emotional logic that said, you were strangers in the land of Egypt. No one did anything to lift a finger for you. Therefore, you don't owe anybody anything. And yet here you have the other pole. You were strangers in the land of Egypt. No one lifted a finger for you. Therefore, always be among those who lift a finger for the vulnerable and the downtrodden. Now, the reason I am underscoring this is I would argue that victims of trauma, as a rule, have both of those voices inside of them. There is the voice inside you that says, if you had had my mother, you would know that I don't owe anybody anything. And there's the other voice that says, oh, I had my mother. Every child who has a mother like that feels like my responsibility. And in many ways, the moral life, the spiritual life, both are bound up with how do I cultivate the latter voice and subdue or even heal the former voice. It reminds me of something Leon Wieseltier said in a lecture that I read during the Bosnian War in the 90s. He said, the Holocaust enlarged our Jewish hearts even as it shrunk them. The Holocaust enlarged our Jewish hearts even as it shrunk them. That, I think, is like a very powerful admission of the two impulses. And I'm underscoring this because it seems to me that the Torah is here. It's important to understand what the Torah is doing. The Torah is asking us to take one of these voices and nurture, cultivate, develop it, in fact, make it the center of our collective moral life, and to subdue or even heal the other voice. Now, this, I think, branches out into a meta point, which is memory is underdetermined. Memory on its own, I think, does not mean anything at all. If I said to you, what are the moral lessons of Auschwitz? You could conclude one pole and its opposite. Auschwitz says, never trust anyone again. You don't know anybody anything. Look out for your own. Auschwitz means everyone who's vulnerable and degraded feels like my responsibility. Is one of those more inherently the meaning of Auschwitz? I'm not sure. In other words, to put this in another way, we shape the memory that in turn shapes us. We make choices about what memory will mean. And that requires an enormous sense of moral responsibility. Those of you who are Christian on this call, you will notice there's a certain parallel between what I'm arguing here and what Miroslav Volf has argued in his writing on memory. Now, what I want to suggest here is that what these verses are essentially saying, I think this is just a useful way to break this down. These verses are asking for a double act of moral imagination. First of all, rather than just thinking that our ancestors were strangers in the land of Egypt, we are supposed to imagine that we ourselves were strangers in the land of Egypt. That's the Bechol Dor Vador in every generation, right? Person has to see herself as if she left Egypt. And then once we have committed the first act, once we have engaged in the first act of moral imagination, we ourselves were strangers. We engage in a second act of moral imagination, which is to imagine the experience of the other people who are currently in real life strangers. Right? These verses are directed at Israelites who will be on some level sovereign in their land. And so they have to remember that they were strangers, even though it was really their parents or their grandparents. And then they have to imagine themselves in the shoes of those who are strangers among them. Now that they are powerful rather than powerless, how do they find ways to empathize and identify with those who are presently powerless? Now, these points I've been making, about memory come to a head in a really interesting way in 20th century Jewish thought during the genocide in Bosnia, when even Elie Wiesel, the great prophet of memory in late 20th century Jewish life, gives a talk in which he says, I'm noticing that basically the genocide in Bosnia is a relitigation of a battle that took place 600 years ago. These grudges are centuries old. So I think I need to stop talking about memory is inherently a virtue and talk about what kind of memory is inherently a virtue. What kind of memory do I need to cultivate? What moral valence should memory have? Now, I should say, and this is not a problem I can solve for us. I just want to note, the other side of memory that I'm talking about finds its way into the Torah itself. That is to say, in the mitzvah of blotting out Amalek, where Israel is commanded to nurse a grudge against Amalek and to treat the grandchildren of the Amalekites as enemies of Israel and of God. So in a way, I think there's something really striking about the juxtaposition of loving the stranger and obliterating the Amalekite. And if people want to share their own thoughts about that, I'm happy to hear them. But I think there's something very rich and I think actually quite confusing about that. I don't know if Richard Middleton, if you're on this call, if you have thoughts there, I'd be curious to hear them. Now, Shmot and Vayikra. Now let's move to Devarim. On the surface, Devarim just reiterates what Vayikra said. But in fact, if we read carefully, I think Devarim, in a really interesting way, intensifies, and you'll see what I mean in a minute, theologizes what Vayikra has done. So Deuteronomy chapter 10, Ki Adonai Elohechem hu Elohei Elohim va'Adonai Adonim. For the Lord your God is the God of all gods and the Lord of all lords. JPS here weasels a little bit because it's nervous about the polytheistic sound of this verse. God is the God of all gods and the Lord of all lords. Ha'el Hagadol Hagibor v'Hanorah. Familiar words, obviously, from the Amida, right? The great, the mighty, and the awesome God. Asher lo yisafanim v'lo yikach shochad, who does not play favorites or take bribes, which is, by the way, I think a way of saying God is unimpressed by wealth. You can't, donate money to build the shul and then treat your workers like garbage. God is unimpressed by that. That's what it means. You can't bribe God. Martin Buber writes beautifully about this, that people often think that, they can make a bargain with God. I'll give you religion, just stay out of my tax returns, right? And it doesn't work that way. Okay, now, how is that manifest? You might think that the God who is supremely powerful and, the God who is the supreme God and the supreme Lord shows that by being utterly omnipotent and smiting his enemies, but no. Oseh mishpat yatom v'almana, God champions the cause of the orphan and the widow, v'ohev ger, and loves the stranger, latet lo lechem v'simla, by giving the stranger food and clothing. And then verse 19, v'havtem et hager, you must love the stranger, kigerim hitem be'eretz Mitzrayim, because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Now, JPS does something that they should not do here in a translation. They make an interpretive move. Instead of rendering verse 19 as, you shall love the stranger, they render, you too shall love the stranger, which is not in the Hebrew, but which is the central theological point here, I'll suggest, which is that what Deuteronomy, Devarim, is doing here is elevating love of the stranger to the level of imitatio Dei, of imitation of God. Just as God loves the stranger, so should you love the stranger, and in so doing, you are behaving in a way that is godly. There's a larger point here. This is a point that many of you have heard me talk about endlessly, and that is a major thrust in everything I try to say in the world. If you want to claim to worship God, you have to love those whom God loves. Which is why one of the most important questions you can ever ask yourself or anyone else is, whom does your God love? Right? So we have here this really interesting statement here that God specifically loves the stranger, and therefore so must you, because you must love whom God loves. The Maharal talks about, the way in which if you love someone, you have to love their kid, right? Or you have to strive to. Okay. Now, so in other words, whereas Leviticus said, what would intensify this obligation for you is what you've been through, Deuteronomy says, what intensifies this obligation is what you've been through, but also what the God you claim to worship cares about. The God you claim to worship says, right? Oh, you love me, I love strangers. And therefore, so must you. Now, there's another way to read the connection between verse 18 and 19. This is something that I got from a Bible scholar named Daniel Carroll, and I think this is a really important point that I had really not seen, and I think most Bible scholars do not notice this, which is another way of understanding the link between 18 and 19 is that God, we are told in verse 18, gives the stranger food and clothing. Now, you might ask, how does God do that? What do you mean? Does God drop clothing from the sky? The answer is, how does God do it? By issuing a command to you. You are the means by which God offers food and clothing to the stranger, right? This must be done through you. I was rereading something in I and Thou yesterday by Martin Buber, and he has this wonderful line, which I'm going to totally butcher right now, but he says that the Lord's Prayer should be rewritten to say something like, "Thy will be done by me, who you need." Not "thy will be done," as in you, God, should do it, but your will be done, and let me be the means by which you go about doing it. Okay, so to recapitulate where we've come so far, we have the book of Exodus, do not oppress. Leviticus, do not oppress plus love. Deuteronomy, amplification of raising of the stakes so that it's not just about memory anymore, it's also about the imitation of God. Okay, now let's take a step back and talk about what the ger means, at least briefly. So as I've already said, a ger is a vulnerable outsider, not part of the kin group, and therefore subject to exploitation. Now, when we refer to a ger as a stranger, the critique that some recent Bible scholars have made of the language of calling them a stranger, is that a stranger only describes the present tense of the person. That is, a person is here, and while they're here, they have the status of the stranger. But what some Bible scholars have argued is that in order to understand the predicament and the situation of the person, we also have to know something about what would have likely brought them to be living in a foreign land. And since that wasn't something people did, for like economic opportunity, in other words, I have perfectly nice upper middle class life here, but I can get a raise if I move to Chicago. But rather, most likely, when people leave and enter a foreign land, it's because of social or political upheaval, war, famine, economic trouble, oppression, whatever it might be. That has led people, Frank Spina is the Bible scholar who's most kind of passionately argued this, to suggest that ger should be considered an immigrant, because he thinks the word immigrant describes both the present status of the person and the past status that brought them into this present status. Can you give me a nod of the head if that's clear? That the word immigrant captures past and present in the way that the word stranger captures only present. I hope that's clear. Now, some people have recently argued that we should translate ger as refugee, and I myself at first was kind of tempted by that. But I have to say, I've come to think that that's wrong, because while you could argue that all refugees can be gerim, not all gerim are refugees. Not everyone who leaves because they're not making it economically has the status of a refugee. And the translation of the term as refugee, that is a Trump era product, and I suspect is, laudably in my view, but that is motivated by more political motivations, I think. So again, a refugee might be a ger, but a ger is not necessarily a refugee. Ger is a more expansive category potentially than refugee. Now, let's head into a more obscure territory for just a moment, because I think this is fascinating. In Akkadian, one of Hebrew's cognate languages, in Akkadian, the root for ger, that root means enemy or hostile one. And I think that the Torah is doing something interesting here, which is suggesting love the one you are tempted to think of as an enemy, one who comes with hostile intentions. A really interesting example of this, which I probably should have put on this source sheet, is how Pharaoh speaks about the Israelites in the first chapter of Exodus by saying that Israel is rav ve'atzum mimenu, which I've talked about before is one of the great expressions of xenophobia in biblical language. Rav ve'atzum mimenu can mean either more numerous than we or too numerous for us. Xenophobia in a nutshell, right? And then immediately what Pharaoh says is, if there's a war, there'll be a fifth column. So be careful about assuming without basis that an outsider is an enemy. Now, to be clear, just so we don't, enter into the land of Pollyannas, sometimes people do come with hostile intentions. I don't think this is a prescription for naivete. It's a prescription for actually a certain kind of reflectiveness about how quickly we're tempted to make assumptions about people and their motivations. Now, when I started, I talked about how this was one of the Bible's greatest moral revolutions and not just its greatest moral challenges. Moral challenges because almost every civilization everywhere has failed at this. Moral revolutions for the following reason. All over the ancient Near East, there is a preoccupation with protecting the well-being of widows and orphans. But the Bible is utterly unique in expanding the category of widows and orphans to include strangers. And that is an enormous moral revolution that I want to make explicit. Widows and orphans are our vulnerable. The stranger is the vulnerable. The Bible takes the category of the vulnerable, which the whole ancient Near East thinks you should be careful and solicitous of, and says not just our vulnerable, but the vulnerable, the outsider who's economically and politically vulnerable to exploitation. He falls into the same category as the widow and the orphan. That is a stunning moral revolution. Now, another point here about these verses. In Musar, in the Musar movement in modern times, Rabbi Eliyahu Lopian actually says something that I think is really profound. And Ilyana, if you can scroll back for a second to the Exodus passage, where he says, the Torah says, "V'atem yidatem et nefesh hager," you know the feelings of the stranger. Rav Lopian says, Reb Elia is what he's known as. Reb Elia says, that's actually a mitzvah. It's not just a descriptive, you know what it feels like, but it's a commandment. You have to know your own heart, lest you end up inflicting what has been done to you onto others. And that brings us back to my quote from Rabbi Reznikov the other night, right? You have an obligation to know your own estrangement, to know your own suffering, to know your own vulnerability, so that you don't end up turning it on other people. It's breaking the cycle of repetition. Okay. Now, if we scroll down, I want to go actually a tiny drop out of order. I think it's, Ilyana, if we can scroll down to the very last source for a minute. I want to change the order of this as I'm thinking about the logic. Great. Source 9. So this, I think, is interesting, and I'm not going to really develop this. I want to leave this for people to sort of tease out and think about themselves. Leviticus 25 makes the really interesting claim that you can't sell the land permanently. Land in ancient Israel is not a commodity. It's an inheritance, which is a totally different thing. That's what the real sin of Achav's treatment of Navot is in Navot's vineyard. Achav thinks land is a commodity. Navot understands that it's an inheritance. But so God says, you cannot sell the land permanently. Why? Kili haaretz, because the entire earth and the land is mine. And you, Israelites, are gerim v'toshavim atem imadi. You are strangers resident with me. What I think is interesting about this is that God seems to want the Israelites to have a sense of always being strangers. They are not the landowners. They are outsiders. The only real landlord is God. And somehow, perhaps, vulnerability will awaken them to greater sensitivity to the vulnerability of others to their power. So there's a way in which what Leviticus does is say, by the way, it's not only that you were strangers long ago, it's that you are strangers even now, because you are always guests and visitors, because God is the only real landlord. Okay, with that, let's scroll back to source, I think it's 4. This is a little bit more out there, what I want to try to suggest. And here, what I'm going to say is completely indebted to a Bible scholar who recently passed away named Patrick Miller, who was a professor at the Princeton Theological Seminary. Patrick Miller pointed out that on his interpretation, several of the most kind of well-known biblical narratives are there, at least in part, to elicit empathy on the part of the reader for the status of gerim. One example that he gives of this is the famous story in Genesis 12, where immediately after God makes these promises to Abraham, and Abraham arrives in the land, there is a famine in the land, and Abraham and Sarah go down to Egypt. And as you know, enormously controversial, Abraham asks Sarah to tell Pharaoh that she's his sister, etc., etc. Now, and there's a tremendous amount of debate among traditional exegetes as well as modern scholars about whether Abraham did the wrong thing, did the right thing, what choices did he have, what should he have done. Miller takes his kind of lens and puts it somewhere else and says he thinks that the reason this story is here is to show you very early on in the experience of the Israelites how strangers are often put in situations where they are so powerless that they are faced with impossible moral predicaments. And that you're supposed to feel for Abraham's powerlessness in this moment, whether you condone what he did or condemn it. You're supposed to understand that as an Israelite in Egypt, his hands are tied. He doesn't have any good options. And that's what happens when you're an outsider. And then I think most extraordinarily poignantly in source 5, and this we'll look at a little more carefully, source 5, Ileana, scroll down, thank you. There's a really, this you have to read, this is like an example of how slowly you have to read. So the context here is that Lot has welcomed these guests, and the people of Sodom want to take them out to rape them. And Lot says to them in verse 7 of Genesis 19, Al na achai tareyu. I beg you, my brothers, do not do this evil thing. He addresses them as achai, my brothers, as if he is one of them. And they say, in verse 9, by the way, and then he makes this horrific offer, which is rape my daughters instead, which is almost unfathomably horrific to even think about. And that's, I'm just sort of want to name that and acknowledge that. But then in verse 9, they say, Ha'echad balagur vayishpot shafot. They say, you're not an ach. Who do you think you are addressing us as your brothers? You came here as a ger. You're an outsider. Do not have the audacity to address us as equals. You're not one of us. This is, I think, an astonishingly sensitive reading on Miller's part. That what you have here is this, this on one level, they're just being cruel, but on another level, they're being cruel and xenophobic at the same time. Cruel and belittling of the outsider. You are not one of us. You have no status to even address us in this way. And I think that that's, essentially them reminding him, you may think you're a brother, but in fact, you're anything but. You can almost hear the contemporary jeer, go back to where you came from, right? Okay. Now, the centrality of empathy in all this is also seeable by the fact that, and here again, I could have brought more sources, but the Exodus itself is arguably launched by an act of empathy, right? Pharaoh's daughter grows up in a home of royalty in a country in which the Jews have been thoroughly dehumanized by her own father. But what she sees is a baby crying. And knowing that the child is a Hebrew, but a child and a human being, therefore, she takes the child into her arms, essentially, and cares for him. I say this because, and this will lead into what I want to talk about at the end, empathy is one crucial way, I'm not sure it's the only way, but it is one crucial way to discover or rediscover a sense of shared humanity with those in a society who are otherwise dehumanized. Something similar goes on, I think this is related, in Moshe's empathy for non-Israelite, non-Egyptians, right? It's striking that Moshe is chosen by God after three things. He saves an Israelite from an Egyptian. He tries to save an Israelite from an Israelite. And then, fascinatingly, he saves Midianite women from Midianite men. And it's only when he seems to care about the outsider to him, neither an Israelite nor an Egyptian, that God says, you know what? I like this guy, right? That he displays ethnic solidarity, siding with the Israelites, but also human solidarity, siding with Midianites, and also, crucially, siding with women as opposed to men. I think I wrote about this in the Heart of Torah. That passage in Exodus always reminds me of this passage I remember from Frederick Douglass's diaries, where he talks about the reason he got so involved in women's suffrage is because when he was fighting for the rights of the slave, he knew he was fighting for himself. But when he fought for women's suffrage, he says, for the first time in my life, I have tasted of nobility, right? Because this is not about me. It's about actually caring for something that's not me. Okay. Now, so in light of what Rav Lopian said before, what I want to encourage us to do, if we make this our own moral and spiritual challenge, it's to ask ourselves, what do we do with our own suffering? Because to say it in a very radical way, but I think in a very pshat way, the Torah's message is that we are obligated to turn memory into empathy and suffering into love. To turn memory into empathy and suffering into love. That is what these verses are really in some fundamental way for and about. Now, I should say, given how loaded some of these discussions are, that I think this should be obvious, but I don't think you can learn details of contemporary public policy from an ancient Near Eastern text, no matter how holy or divine. You cannot read Leviticus 19 and say, oh, this shows me that the number of Syrians who should be allowed into the States this year is 150,000 and not 20,000. What you can learn, I think, is a general thrust and an orientation. You can learn, for example, that the demonization and dehumanization of immigrants and refugees is a theological abomination and utterly intolerable to God. But the Bible can't give you policy answers, in a granular way. It's not doing halakha. It's doing general thrust, which is worth a lot and matters a tremendous amount. Now, I won't go into this at length here tonight. There's a whole bunch of recordings where I talk about this in different iterations on the Hadar website. I think this idea of loving the stranger is part of the Bible's more general commitment that Sinai is about revealing a blueprint for a radical alternative to Egypt. The Israelites are essentially asked to build a society that represents everything that Egypt was not. Egypt was cruel to the outsider. Israel must welcome the outsider. Egypt took advantage of slaves. Israel must humanize slavery as much as possible. I'll give you an example of this that I think it's fascinating. You have to know something about the ancient Near East to get this. Scroll down, if you would, Eliana, to source 8. So all over the ancient Near East, it is considered illegal by threat of severe punishment and sometimes even death to harbor a fugitive slave. In light of that, in light of the enormity of the crime of harboring a fugitive slave, Deuteronomy 23 is amazing. Lo taskir eved el adonav, you may not return a fugitive slave to his master. Asher yinatzel elecha me'im adonav, who runs away to you from his master. And yinatzel elecha is odd Hebrew. It's mainly there because the root lahatzil is what God does to Israel in Egypt. So when a fugitive slave runs away from Lebanon, let's say, and finds his way into the land, you may not return him, but rather, 5 different ways of saying this. Imcha yeshev, with you will he live. Bekirbecha, in your midst. Bamakom asher yivchar, wherever he damn well chooses, is how I would translate that. I think that's literally the thrust there. Be'achad she'arecha, in any one of your settlements. Batovlo, where it's good for him. And then lo tonenu, he's going to be a stranger. You better not take advantage of him. Don't let the slave come only so you could take advantage of him, right? Now, 5 different ways that Israelites are told You know what God, think about runaway slaves? The runaway slave knocks on your apartment door and says, I'll take your living room. It's his. You know why? This is just about slowing down and reading. You are a nation of runaway slaves. And when your master chased you, did I give you back? No. I gave you a home in my land. That's what you have to do. Now, here's where this gets even more radical. And for this, I'm indebted to the Bible scholar Dennis Olson, who makes this just astonishingly beautiful point. The phrase "Bamakom asher yivchar" appears 18 times in the book of Deuteronomy. 17 times it refers to God's choice to dwell in Jerusalem. In the 18th time, it refers to the slave's choice to dwell wherever he wants. I have an essay on this in the Heart of Torah, the subtitle of which is Why Runaway Slaves Are Like God. That is, they have absolute freedom to decide where they will dwell. That's the part of this vision of Israelite society being a radical alternative to Egypt. And where contemporary or modern Jews will argue with each other is when some modern Jews decide that some parts of the blueprint actually recapitulate Egypt instead of creating an alternative to it. And people will disagree about how much interpretive power people have in continuing the process of textual and legal interpretation. Now, I promised I would say something about empathy for and against. So let me just, this may be familiar to some people, but I just want to sort of lay it out here because I think the Torah does have a strong view about this. So in recent years, a psychologist, a professor of psychology at Yale, Paul Bloom, has argued that empathy is essentially a scourge. Empathy is a terrible thing. He makes three core arguments, which I'll just put my cards on the table. I'll make them as best as I can. I don't find them convincing, but I'll make them as best as I can. One, empathy focuses on the few whose suffering has become salient to us, helping us forget the many others who also need our help. We end up supporting people who we feel for rather than, say, people who need our help most dramatically. Related to that, and maybe another way of saying the same thing, it is easier, Bloom points out, to empathize with those who are similar to us. Empathy, in other words, all too often reflects our biases, and there are empirical studies to suggest that white people empathize with white people more than they do with black people. Okay? Empathy, he says, distorts our moral judgments in pretty much the same way that prejudice does. It is a very strong sentence. Empathy distorts our moral judgments in pretty much the same way that prejudice does. Third, he argues, empathy is innumerate. Show someone a picture of a suffering child and she will likely open her wallet. Tell her more abstractly about 100 children far away and she will likely remain unmoved. So empathy, he says, is innumerate, and he gives the example of, a child falls into a well and the entire country rallies, but meanwhile, hundreds of children can't eat today and no one does anything or cares. Now, I want to comment especially on number 2, that is, that empathy reinforces our prejudices. Like many other emotions, empathy is double-edged. It can limit our horizons, but perhaps it can also expand them. We see our enemy as less than human until we notice her crying over the deaths of her child, just as we would. I've always been extremely moved by the fact that the rabbis derive the cries of the shofar from the cries of Sisera's mother. Sisera is an enemy of the Jews. He's a horrible enemy. And yet the shofar conjures up his mother crying, wondering when he'll come home. It somehow wants to humanize even our enemy in that moment. So in a fascinating way, so you have Paul Bloom, who says empathy is actually toxic. And then you have Franz de Waal, the great primatologist, come along and say, are you kidding? Empathy is the one thing that overcomes prejudice because, to use his language, emotions defy ideology. Emotions defy ideology. In many ways, I would say that's what describes Pharaoh's daughter. Emotions defy ideology. She sees a baby, not a dehumanized Israelite. Bloom's alternative to empathy, somewhat, well, I'll hold my editorial for now. His alternative to empathy is impartial moral reasoning. The problem is, I think, that empathy can indeed limit our moral vision, as I said, but it's worth noting that reason also can be marshaled for nefarious ends. Bloom fails, or people like him tend to fail, to engage seriously with the limits of deliberative reasoning. So, for example, Nazi doctors use their intelligence to talk themselves into doing terrible things, as Bloom acknowledges, right? And as he himself admits, they would have been better off listening to their hearts. He opens this door, but he refuses to walk through it. So the point that I'm really making here is that empathy is like the other things that I've been talking about tonight. It's double-edged. It's underdetermined. So we have an obligation to cultivate empathy, not just for my own kid, but for the kid who's not part of my community, the kid who doesn't look anything like my kid, and to open myself to the experience of empathy that humanizes those who might otherwise be dehumanized. So what I'm saying, in other words, is that rather than insisting that emotions are unreliable and that reason is the answer, we would do well to explore how both emotions and deliberative reasoning can lead us astray. To say that empathy leads us astray and reason will save us is frankly facile and, in my view as a philosopher, totally unconvincing. Distressing as it may be to admit, neither reason nor emotion guarantees moral goodness. Moral goodness takes work and self-conscious self-cultivation. Now, one last word about this before we move to questions. What does empathy actually mean? I've been talking about it a lot. And empathy is a notoriously slippery term. It's used by different people in different ways. It can make you crazy. If you read philosophy or psychology journals on empathy, you will see that it's like every researcher uses the term in a different way. Bloom offers a definition of empathy that is, in my view, somewhat silly and a little bit of a caricature. He says that empathy is the act of feeling what you believe other people feel, experience what they experience. But this, I would argue to you, is not at all what empathy means. When someone says, I want to find an empathic therapist, they do not mean that if they go to their therapist's office depressed, when they leave, the therapist should be depressed also, which is the way Bloom seems to define it. Rather, what they mean is having an emotionally appropriate response to someone else's suffering. And that is at least partially determined by circumstance, right? So empathy doesn't mean literally having the experience of emotional contagion. You're depressed, so I get depressed. It means that I have a response to you that is emotionally appropriate and that I convey to you some emotionally appropriate response to your predicament. I say all this again because I think the Torah here is making a choice to encourage us to cultivate empathy, but to ask us in some fundamental way to let empathy push us beyond our normal, expected, conventional borders. That is, empathy not just for our fellow Israelites, but for the outsider who lives among us Israelites. And that is, as I suggested before, one of the Bible's great moral revolutions. I'll add as a footnote that later Jewish thought, as you know, the word ger comes to mean convert. And I'm happy to talk about why that might have happened. But I think it's important to know that in my best understanding of the history of halakha, when the rabbis take a verse and interpret it halachically in a kind of metaphorical way or in a way that is not the pshat nevertheless retains legal force. So that, for example, lifnei iver lo titein michshol, not to place a stumbling block before the blind, which is used to, like, let's say it is halachically prohibited to give someone bad advice. But it also remains halachically prohibited, nonetheless, for me to find Deborah Carno and put a literal stumbling block while I have her blindfolded. That remains the halacha. So even if the halacha is that, you may not oppress or mistreat a convert, the original and obvious meaning of ger as an outsider also remains always in force. Okay, thank you. We'll go to questions. Ileana, you can Give me a round of 3 when you're ready.
Okay. I will put my video back on. Let's start with, we have a question from Ezra Fishman who asks, is the idea that prohibitions, lo ta'aseh, are more severe or more important than affirmative commitments, mitzvot aseh, is it a rabbinic idea, or is that assumed in the Tanakh also? You got that?
Yeah.
Okay.
An interesting question.
Okay. We have Harvey Tessler who asks, what is the difference between goyim versus garim to indicate a non-Jew? Is it about vulnerability, and is that the point of loving the stranger? And we have Deborah who asks, how is taking care of thee instead of our stranger vulnerable, or no, rather, I'm going to start again. How is taking care of thee instead of our vulnerable related to the tendency of seeing our neighbor as part of our group instead of universal, as we discussed in the last class?
Okay, great. Ezra Fishman, your question is really interesting and throws me for a loop because I really don't know how to answer it. Does the Torah assume that mitzvot lo ta'aseh, that prohibitions are somehow more weighty than mitzvot aseh? I'm going to give you an answer that will be one for the ages. I really don't know. I'm not sure I've ever really thought about that before. I can tell you a great joke, which some of you will really appreciate. The difference between a Hasidic heretic, an Hasidic apikoros, and a Misnagdish apikoros. A Misnagdic apikoros does none of the mitzvot aseh, but also obviously doesn't do the mitzvot lo ta'aseh. A Hasidic apikoros does all the mitzvot aseh, but also all the mitzvot lo ta'aseh. If you follow what I just said, you're very lucky. Otherwise, what I said was totally incoherent. Ezra, I got to get back to you on that. I really got to think about that. Is that a biblical idea? I'm not sure. It's such a striking question. I don't know. If I understood the question correctly, goyim versus gerim, was that the question? So, I mean, goyim, as they are called in colloquial Jewish language, is not a halachic category. It's a colloquial category, often but not always with some negative valence attached to it. I think that if I could be so obnoxious as to say the better question is the relationship between gerim and nochrim, which is something I still need to work on. Nochrim are outsiders who do not have the status of ger. Some people argue that a nochri is someone who is visiting the land for business opportunity and therefore that doesn't have the same vulnerability and therefore is not the recipient of the same kind of specially solicitous treatment. So vulnerability is certainly crucial here. But I'm not sure gerim and goyim really are the right juxtaposition. One is a biblical category and one is a later colloquial Jewish category. If I didn't answer your question or didn't understand it right, feel free to type in and help and help me understand it better. Now, regarding the vulnerable versus seeing our neighbor as part of our group, I love that question because I think what this does is capture the dialectic beautifully. Do we have special obligations to our own group? Yes. Do we have universal obligations to all human beings? Also, yes. Do we choose between those two? No, we live in the semicolon between them. In other words, yes. I mean, it's almost like the Torah is playing with us in a really interesting way. Okay, love your neighbor, your fellow member of the covenant as yourself. And then 13 voices later, also, by the way, the non-member of the covenant, but who's vulnerable to your power, love them too. Now, if you want to then ask the question, what about the stranger who lives half a world away? So I think it's worth, there are things I could say about that from the perspective of moral philosophy and even of Jewish thought, but I think it's worth saying the Bible doesn't have any conception of people living half a world away. It doesn't have that kind of global consciousness. No one in the ancient world does. But I think that what your question gets at really is the almost wondrous dialectic that on the one hand, you can't really say to people, don't love your own brother more than you love someone else. On the other hand, you have to be careful lest loving your own brother come to the exclusion of loving someone else. What I always like to say about this, if this is helpful for some people, family first is a totally defensible moral value, except when family first deteriorates and devolves into family only. And so what I think the love of the stranger does is right away say, okay, family first, but not family only. You have people, by the way, Haredim. So for those of you who may have some stereotypes about what Haredim think, you have Haredi thinkers who will say, yeah, you don't have to love non-Jews because of the mitzvah of love your neighbor as yourself. You have to love them because they're created in the image of God and they're God's children. And that's so you have this kind of dialectic. And if this is a little bit elusive and complex, it should be. This is living in the messiness of moral theory. You can have two obvious choices here. You can say, I only have obligation to my family, or you can take a certain kind of radical utilitarian approach and say, I don't owe my family any more than I owe a stranger 6,000 miles away. Both of those views are very problematic. And so I think that Jewish ethics invites us to live in the muck of not an either or, but a yes. I have special obligations to those who are close to me, and I have obligations to all. Ileana, you want to do another round? I'm totally preoccupied with Ezra's question. I don't really know what to do with it. But go ahead, Ileana.
All right. Let's do another few. Jared and Rachel Lucker asked, what is the difference between empathy and sympathy according to the sages?
Okay.
Joel Goldstein asked, what type of memory is it in Devarim when we're commanded, and forgive my Hebrew, lo titaev mitzrei ki ger hayita be'artso?
Okay.
And Sarah Kupor asked, regarding source number 2, how can we talk about loving the stranger in your land when we are asked, rather commanded, to kill, exile, or put into servitude the 7 nations? If they have special status in terms of wrongdoing, what are those wrongs, and how about what it does to the Israelites spiritually to wage these kinds of war in the land of Israel?
Sarah, why don't you ask me a hard question? Why don't you give me something I have to think about? Okay. So, the empathy-sympathy question is really interesting, but it's hard to answer for 2 reasons. One is that if empathy and if the word empathy means different things to different researchers, the word sympathy all the more so. Martha Nussbaum, I think, in one of her essays, points out that words that we are completely convinced what they mean, empathy versus sympathy, if you go back 100 years, they mean they have the exact opposite meaning. So that sympathy means one thing and empathy means another, right? And pity, for example, doesn't have any of the negative connotations that it has now. So it's very hard to answer because I don't know what the biblical or rabbinic Hebrew word for empathy as opposed to sympathy would be. What a lot of people, I think, these days take sympathy to be is a less emotionally intense form of empathy. Is there a rabbinic version of that? I'm not sure. It's really not a good answer. It's because I think that the linguistic issues here get very complicated. Maybe we could ask a question: is there some other form of ethical response that is weaker than empathy and yet nevertheless still valuable, still to be cultivated? I'm not sure what the answer to that is. By the way, in contemporary moral language, you might also ask a different question. What's the relationship between empathy and compassion? Which is also enormously complex, and what people debate like crazy about what compassion ought to mean. So I'm really just, I'm doing the ultimate annoying thing that teachers sometimes do. I'm kind of underlining your question and saying it's a great question, but it's very hard to go about this because of the linguistic gaps. To Joel Goldstein's question, so Deuteronomy says, just to clarify what Joel was alluding to, Lo tuta'ev mitzri kegerim ha'item be'artzo. You may not hate the Egyptian because you were a stranger in his land. I have always been under the impression that in that verse, it is actually alluding not to the experience of oppression in Egypt, but rather to the experience of having been welcomed there when Israel was first suffering from the predicament of famine. You shall not hate the Egyptians because they welcomed you when you were starving. But even that is sort of alarming when you start making comparisons. Do you want to say you shall not hate, maybe you do want to say this, you shall not hate the Germans because you were welcomed in Weimar, Germany, because there was a great German-Jewish symbiosis. I mean, there's something about that that leaves us a little uneasy, I think. But I think that that's what's going on here. In other words, I think in contrast to places where there's an appeal to the experience of being an oppressed stranger, here in the verse you mentioned, I think it's about the experience of being a welcomed stranger. Okay. Now to Sarah's question. I mean, oh God, it's just, so let me give you, first of all, a literal answer to this question. The stranger whom we are to not oppress and love is the stranger who comes into our land after we are sovereign, after the war to conquer the land has already taken place, meaning there are different categories. Canaanites are not gerim. Now, you then asked a different question, which is not exactly our topic, but I'm gonna try to use it, try to respond to it. How can the Torah command this? So I want to say one traditionalist thing and then two more modernist things. The traditionalist thing is that I think it's interesting that although the rabbinic tradition does not feel it has the prerogative to say this commandment is immoral and therefore inoperative, it does feel it has the authority to say this commandment was one time only and is never allowed to be precedential, right? It's to say the text is pragmatically neutralized, even if not theologically harmonized, right? That and I think is actually quite important from within the range that the rabbis allow themselves, the range of thinking about disturbing texts. Now, two things about Deuteronomy chapter 7. One of which I will say, for those of you who are scandalized by biblical criticism, you should mute me now for the next minute. So some Bible scholars will say, well, it never happened. To me, that's not all that helpful because the fact is, in memory, it did happen, even if in history it didn't. But here's the thing that's interesting. If Bible scholars are right that Deuteronomy emerges in the 7th century, then when Deuteronomy emerges, every single one of the 7 nations that Israelites are commanded to eliminate have been dead for 400 years. Which leads me to think that it was obvious to whoever heard that text that it was not meant ever to be taken literally. Canaanites disappeared by the year 1000. Deuteronomy is 300 years later. It would be like my saying to you, hey, Ilana, can you go murder Thomas Jefferson for me? At a certain level, you're going to say, well, wait, what could you possibly, what? Thomas Jefferson, I mean, he's been dead for hundreds of years. So what do you mean by that? Also, Deuteronomy winks at you. Deuteronomy 7:1 says, when you get there, you should kill them all. Deuteronomy 7:2 then says, also be careful not to marry them. Excuse me, but that's insane. If you're going to murder people, presumably you're not going to marry them, unless the purpose of verse 2 is to make you real. I'm not telling you to commit genocide, for God's sake, get a hold of yourself. Now, you can say if you want, as Jeffrey Tigay, for example, does in the JPS Deuteronomy commentary, no, that's just explaining to you why you have to kill them, because if you don't kill them, you'll marry them. With great respect for Jeffrey Tigay, who knows more about Tanakh, who's forgotten probably more about Tanakh than I know, I don't buy it. I don't see it. And by the way, if you read the book of Joshua is like a snake that eats its own tail. Every time the book of Joshua says that the Israelites killed everyone in a certain area, the next verse will then say, and these are the people who survived. So they wiped out everyone. Here are all the places where nobody was wiped out. And at a certain point, you begin to wonder what is really going on in this text. Now, I am not trying to say, oh, this is wonderful and doesn't raise any moral problems. It surely does. But I think that if we read carefully, Deuteronomy is saying something else, which is trying to express some kind of anxiety about outside influence. Deuteronomy is a purist party. It is a party of worshiping Yud-He Vav-He alone. It is a party of being careful about idolatrous influences from other peoples. I remain extremely skeptical that Deuteronomy ever meant you should go commit genocide. I don't think Deuteronomy can be read that way, and I think it's clear that Joshua can't be read that way. That doesn't solve the problem that Deuteronomy and Joshua have often been heard that way and taught that way. I was taught Joshua that way in high school. But I just don't think that's right. The older I get and the more attention I pay to close literary reading, the more I think the book of Joshua is like, it never gets tired of winking at you and saying, okay, obviously I'm exaggerating. Nicholas Walterstorff, a really important contemporary philosopher, comments about the book of Joshua that you should hear it the same way your teenage son comes home from a football game and says, we won that game, we slaughtered them. He didn't slaughter anybody. That's not what happened. It's a hyperbolic way of talking about victory, conquest, etc. Now, none of this solves the problem of the Exodus from the perspective of the Canaanites, which was not a great liberation, but a cause of great suffering. That is, I in no way mean to step around that, but I thought you were asking a different question, like what would it do to the Israelites? I think you said something to engage in this kind of genocide. I don't think the text is really advocating genocide. I just don't really think that that's the case. There is a really interesting and controversial essay by Edward Said called Exodus from the Perspective of Its Victims. That is a really interesting reading of the Exodus from a Palestinian perspective. And then there's a fascinating exchange between him and Michael Walzer, which is just totally brutal, about whether the Exodus is a useful paradigm for thinking about liberation in Western civilization or not. Ileana, how about one last question if we have one? Do we have any more?
Sure, I can give you, okay, I'll give you one more. Nickel asked, the thrust of these passages is clear and it's compelling and challenging. The challenge is valuable, but at the same time, it is in a context, right? At the risk of neutering the challenge, does this demand that we discard the ethical obligation for those closest to us? To put it crassly, what is the basis for favoring our child over the immigrant?
So, what is the basis for favoring our child over the immigrant? So, I want to give you an essay. This is an answer. This is me talking as a Jewish philosopher, for better or for worse. It's hard for me to say that sentence with a straight face, but I'm going to say it anyway. The Gemara is very clear. Ena Kadosh Baruch Hu ba betronya and habriot. God doesn't give commandments that are impossible. It is impossible for most healthy people to not favor their own children over other people's children. And more than that, most of us would say that something profoundly important morally would be lost in a world in which we were not permitted to have basic relationships. In a world in which a stranger makes the same claim on me as my wife does, something essential to our moral lives would have been lost. By the way, as a footnote to this, at the risk of giving you a headache, the great philosopher Bernard Williams actually says, you know what? Even if it were not true that something morally would be lost, I don't care, because something human would be lost. He famously says, this is one of the great essays, one of the most controversial essays in 20th century moral theory. If someone asks me why, when there's two women drowning in a pool, I saved my wife and not the other person, I will tell them they have asked one question too many. I don't find that question interesting. Now, I'm saying something different. because what Williams is saying is that morality is not the only thing that matters in that moment. I'm actually saying that who we are as moral agents would be compromised if we weren't allowed to care about our family and our friends. Now, again, that said, we have the capacity to then say, so let me ask the question better, if I could. I mean, forgive my chutzpah in saying that I want to ask the question better than you asked it, but I want to take your question and go one step further with it, if you forgive me, which is, okay, so I have to feed my children before I feed someone else's children. Do I have to send my children to a $40,000 a year private school before I feed your children? Do I give my children 2 vacations a year before I feed your children? That's where the questions get interesting to me. It's not, do I have an obligation to feed my child before I have an obligation to feed your child? My answer to that is, of course. Where it gets harder is in the discourse of family only, or family almost to the exclusion of everyone else. And that, I think, is much harder. That's where the real question becomes salient, I think. Now, there's obviously a lot more to say about this. I think what I mean, and I'll just underscore this in one other way. What I mean when I talk about Ena Kadosh Baruch Hu Ba Bitroni and Habriot, God doesn't command things that are impossible. I think another way of saying that is that Jewish ethics works with the grain of our nature and not just against it. It wants us to take certain impulses that we have and expand upon them rather than thwart them. This is not all instincts. Some instincts we're supposed to thwart. Judaism is in favor of monogamy. I will say that till I'm blue in the face, even in a culture where that's becoming a harder argument to sell. Judaism is in favor of monogamy. It tries to get us to thwart the impulse to not be monogamous. But in many cases, Judaism tries to argue, take an impulse that you have and build on it. This reminds me, and I'll end with this, the philosopher Mary Midgley, who recently died. Mary Midgley argues that there are 2 kinds of instincts. There are closed instincts and open instincts. Closed instincts are when you have something that essentially an instinct that has a script attached to it, that there's no choice, like an ant will do X in situation Y. But an open instinct is like, yeah, so I have an instinct to care for my child. Can I use that to expand to care for your child? Yes, I can, because nothing says I care only for my own child, right? I have the capacity to take an instinct and cultivate and develop it so that it becomes a different kind of instinct. I hope that that's at least somewhat clear. We have gotten into some really messy, incredibly difficult stuff here. So I thank you all for your time tonight. Ilyana, if you can save the comments for me, please. And I hope to see all of you on Monday night. Shabbat Shalom.